Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. This is a pivotal time for our nation and our city. Each week until November 4th, we'll be addressing the issues that concern New Yorkers and how the nominees for president and vice president are addressing them and each other. We'll try to assess this extraordinary period with news and government observers and the newsmakers themselves. I'm delighted to welcome Erica Gonzalez, the opinion editor of Diario.La Prensa. She's been a long-time observer of and a participant in government as a reporter with the New York Post, as Director of Communications for the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and since 2006, she's been with Diario.La Prensa, which for 95 years has been serving the Hispanic communities of New York. Am I pronouncing the name of the paper right?
Close
La
enough.
Prensa? Is it La Prensa?
You gotta roll your R a little bit more.
Well, forget it.
That's okay.
You know, if I've been hearing about the paper for years, but if one does not read Spanish, one probably doesn't know a whole lot about the paper. So tell me about, the paper, who your readers are, and what you see as your mission.
Well, as you mentioned, El Diario is in its 95th. DiarioLa Prensa is in its 95th year, and it's more than a newspaper in New York City. It's really an institution. This paper has chronicled historical events for Latinos in New York City. It's been around since Latino communities were budding and integrating themselves and challenging unfair discriminatory practices to chronicling the immense growth and vibrancy of Hispanic communities all over New York City.
So how old is the paper? You go back to when?
Well, there's actually, you had El Diario and you had La Prensa. There was a merger, I believe, in the 50s.
Okay.
So you had two different papers that came together and really put their might behind covering a growing community. At that time was mostly a Puerto Rican community.
Right.
And now we've seen that diversify tremendously.
Yeah. What's your circulation?
Our circulation, our readership is approaching about 300,000. So we have readers in the New York City area, the Long Island, Westchester,
right.
New Jersey. We reach as far as some parts of Connecticut and Boston and Massachusetts. Pennsylvania as well. So we have folks who move away from the city and still want to keep in touch, who are maybe in communities that don't have a Spanish language publication,
right.
and want to still keep in touch with what's going on in New York because they have family and ties here. We have a country-to-country coverage in our daily paper, which is different from a lot of other publications where we have sort of what's going on back home. So we have a lot of people who pipe in online or, buying the print edition
right.
to check in on what's happening, who want to maintain that tie and connection, so they check into what's happening
right.
in their home countries.
Now, I last studied Spanish in the 6th grade. So El Diario does it mean the day or the diary? What does it mean?
Right, the daily.
The daily.
Right.
And La Prensa?
La Prensa means like, translating that literally, the press. It would
the
basically.
Press. Okay. Now you as you said, for many years, the Latinos that people associated with New York were largely Puerto Ricans.
Right.
Is that still, or do Puerto Ricans still predominate, or has that changed?
Well, that's changed, as we've all seen. First, you had sort of the peak for the Puerto Rican community in terms of migration was the decade of the 50s. And then, when we get to the 80s and post-adjustments in immigration, you've had this Dominican community, the growth of the Dominican community. So
right.
you had a sort of a Puerto Rican-Dominican dynamic then for a while. And now you have a rapidly growing Mexican community. So in terms of the major communities, you have Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Mexican, but you also have a sizable, significant Colombian community that's based in Queens, for example. We learned from the City Planning Commission recently that the population division, that the Ecuadorian community is also rapidly growing in Queens, and there was recently an opening of a consulate actually in Elmhurst, so that's also a testament to how that community is growing. So we're getting really an array of communities, and then you have sort of Central Americans in Long Island,
right?
And all of these communities that have sort of the same issues economically to some degree. They're issues that cut across lines, but you also have nuances with each community.
So how have the changing demographics changed your coverage? Affected your coverage?
Well, I think that the breadth of coverage, we cover immigration very intensely because it's an issue that affects a great deal of communities. With Puerto Ricans, it's more like language issues, and that still is a significant issue for Puerto Ricans in New York City, as well as other communities. But immigration is definitely a focus, and the paper's always been a resource for immigrants arriving. So immigrants look to our immigrant readers look to the paper for navigating the city, for finding out the way the bureaucracy works here, finding out what services are available to them, what they can tap, and how they can integrate themselves and also contribute. So, it's definitely a lot broader, and we definitely get into the nuances of communities and how they're, whether it's the Mexican community now in Sunset Park to Puerto Rican community in East Harlem to the growing Dominican community in the Bronx.
Right. So when you say language is a big issue, what do you mean?
Well, for example, in New York City, there's a 3-year waiting list to take English as a second language courses for adults. So there's this myth that immigrants don't want to learn how to speak English. That's a myth locally and nationally, and it's not true. We see it with our readers' experiences. We see it with the kind of announcements we get to our community page, which we keep to the front of the paper, announcing these kind of services. And there really is an eagerness to really integrate and to contribute. And unfortunately, the services are really severely inadequate. There's people who are waiting for years.
That's amazing, because you have people complaining on the one hand they don't want to learn how to speak, they don't want to learn how to speak English, and not to allow them the means to do that.
Well, it's the problem with the coverage of immigrants. It's it's still very one-dimensional in general. And
so, who runs the courses? Is that a government thing or a private thing?
You have a lot of nonprofits that offer English language courses for adults, and you have city agencies that give funding to these nonprofits.
Right.
So it's a combination, and you have private services. Usually, those are pretty expensive.
Right.
So. It's a combination, mostly public sector.
So you consider yourself, I assume, not just a resource and probably the main voice for Latinos in the city.
Right. Our slogan is that we're the champion of Hispanics, campeón de los Hispanos.
You use Hispanic as do you have a preference for Hispanic as opposed to Latino?
I think we use them interchangeably at the paper. In my old activist college days, I was really staunch about using Latino over Hispanic. Both of them are misnomers. We use them interchangeably, and you will find among Latinos, Hispanics that there is, depending on who you talk to, some of them have a preference and some don't. So.
Right. So does the paper focus primarily on New York City, national issues, and how much attention do you pay to what's going on in Puerto Rico, Colombia, Mexico?
Right. Well, it's all of the above. We have our metro section, so we focus on city issues. We report on national issues. Specifically this past year, we've had Hispanic voter section where we're looking at issues and nuances among Hispanic voters, like, for example, Hispanic evangelicals. So we're looking at the campaigns, and we're looking at Hispanic voters, any trends, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned before, we have the country-to-country coverage. So we usually do several pages reporting on what's happening in different countries, and Puerto Rico, Mexico, the Dominican Republic are chief among them.
How big is your staff?
How big is our editorial staff? I would say we have about 30 people, 30 to 40 people.
The former Mayor Koch used to go around asking people, "How am I doing?" Meaning as mayor. How are Hispanics in New York City doing? I know it's a big question.
Right. Hispanics in New York City are dealing with a lot of challenges, a lot of the same challenges that are confronted elsewhere, except that with respect to undocumented immigrants, you have, in terms of city government, you have sort of more of a cooperative, receptive policy. So, for example, the Health and Hospitals Corporation had a campaign just to remind New Yorkers, and they didn't specifically point out undocumented immigrants, but to remind New Yorkers that they could seek reasonable services at local public hospitals, with the attitude that for public safety and public health, you need to make sure that people are accessing health services. So in terms of that, it's and that's just one of several examples. In terms of that, it's helpful, but you have folks who are in limbo because of their status. That's like a chief challenge. Affordable housing is a big one for our readers. We're constantly reporting on mobilizations around gentrification, challenging unethical landlords, getting reports about, really poor conditions, living conditions within certain buildings, tenant harassment, just the pressure on displacement. And the pressure to keep up with paying rents is a huge pressure for Hispanics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but you're talking about New York as being a somewhat more amenable place to immigrants. And I know CUNY, for instance, has this sort of, because you have a lot of students there who don't have Social Security cards, don't have their documents, but CUNY has a sort of don't ask, don't tell kind of policy.
Right.
And therefore is open to a lot of undocumented young people.
I think many people locally recognize the sort of the short-sightedness of barring people from accessing certain institutions and services, and how it's an investment in the long run. The person that you, like the CUNY ads in the train, where you see sort of the student being mentored by a professor in the sciences or in math or in health, there's a sense that, New York City has been such a center for innovation and energy and talent, that there's a sense that the investment produces returns, and it does.
Right. Now, your office was formerly in Lower Manhattan, and now
we're in downtown Brooklyn now. Yes.
Has that changed the way you view the city?
Well, it literally has, in the sense that if you come to our newsroom, to our offices, we have a view of like all of downtown Brooklyn, Manhattan. It's just this expansive, beautiful view from the 18th floor. I think we were always covering issues in Brooklyn and throughout the boroughs, and Long Island and New Jersey as well, and Westchester. Logistically, it makes it easier, of course. It's easier to get a reporter out to something that's happening in Brooklyn because we're already, in the vicinity or nearby, and we have a lot of transportation near us. We have vibrant neighborhoods near us. I think that what's happened is that for staff members who may have not been as familiar with Brooklyn, that has created broader familiarity. So someone who didn't realize that Sunset Park is this, immense center hub for Latinos, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, now understands that. So
right. Okay. We have to take a short break. I'll be back with more with Erica Gonzalez of El Diario La Prensa in a few minutes.
Real men know that getting tested is the way to take care of their families. That's why real men wear gowns. For a list of the tests you need, go to ahrq.gov.
Welcome back. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, talking with Erica Gonzalez, opinion page editor of El Diario La Prensa. What would you say are the hot button issues concerning members of the Latino community during this election period?
Well, as you can guess, as with most Americans, the economy. Latino families want to know if they'll be able to keep their jobs, if they'll be able to put their kids through school, be able to pay their rent. So all of those issues are really important for Hispanics. I think that there's a lot of people suggest that what Latinos find important or what the rest of Americans find important, which is true, but you also have Hispanics that are disproportionately affected by, for example, the foreclosure crisis. So other than the economy, immigration is a big one, healthcare, education, the war in Iraq. So those are the big pressing issues that Hispanics are interested in, that keep coming up in poll after poll and survey after survey.
For a number of years, it appeared that Hispanic voters in the U.S. were leaning more towards the Republican Party. I think about 40% voted for George Bush in the last election. Has that shifted? And, what's your sense of how Hispanics are leaning in this election?
That has shifted. In 2004, what you had was a very tight ground operation designed by Karl Rove to capitalize on the fact that President Bush seemed friendly towards immigrants. So that was able to carve out. The Republicans have always aimed to carve out a slice of Hispanic voters.
Right.
What we're seeing is a shift. The Pew Hispanics Research Center actually put out a study recently that showed that Hispanics are overwhelmingly leaning towards Democrats. That with the on-the-ground operation that both campaigns have had, that you've seen more Hispanics come over to supporting Barack Obama.
Why is that? Do you know why?
Well, first of all, I think that there was a misperception set up during the primaries. Someone put out that Hispanics would not vote for a black candidate, and I think that was sort of set up in folks' mind that Latinos could not be lured in a significant or appealed to in a significant way to support the Democratic candidate. We knew that wasn't true. We've seen, New York City history and other history how Hispanics have voted for black candidates. So I think that was a myth that sort of, treaded for a while and then got sunk with the reality of a very nuanced community. But it's, the economy is a big one and is a big issue that's important to Hispanics, and who's going to be able to really be on the side of working class and middle class families, where Hispanics mostly fall into. So the economy is a big one. And then Iraq. I mean, from time to time, too regularly, we're reporting on Hispanic soldiers being killed in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right.
A street being renamed for someone who was killed. A family in trouble with their status because the soldier they were depending on is no longer with us. So those are two big issues, and I think that the Democrats have done a better job and have been able, because of those issues and where Hispanics are at, been able to make significant inroads with Hispanic voters.
For a while there, everybody was talking about immigration. I don't know where it comes. Did Lou Dom start it? I don't know where it came from, but everybody was talking about the immigration problem. And then, as soon as we got into the election, it sort of evaporated.
Right.
And neither candidate seems to want to address it. Does this concern you? And I mean, is there either candidate who seems to have a more credible immigration plan?
Well, it does concern us. I mean, we have actually an editorial in today's paper that talks about the silence of the candidate. So we recognize that there's this tactical silence around immigration because it's such a lightning rod. So either one probably doesn't want to, is obviously not touching it. But immigration, that our country needs to reform immigration is no question. It's a broken system. That immigrants are a scapegoat for economic woes. We're seeing actually who's really what's really at fault for a lot of this economic rupturing that's been happening.
And it's not Hispanic.
And it's not Hispanic immigrants, exactly. So what we saw with John McCain and his appeal to a degree with Hispanics is that he seemed friendly and reasonable on immigration. However, we've seen a shift from his compromise bill in 2007 to really, there was no mention at all at the convention or in the convention platform, the Republican convention platform about immigration. It was really enforcement only emphasis. Now, Senator Barack Obama has mentioned immigrants to a degree. There was a reference in his speech at the Democratic Convention, and his plan, which is more comprehensive, is listed on his site. So, but as of lately, both have been quiet on immigration.
Yeah.
But Latino organizations, national organizations, local organizations that have been rallying for reform have been rallying for comprehensive reform. So, in other words, you just can't have enforcement only. You have to look at where the flaws are, where the fractures are, and remedy those, and think about family unity, think about the workers that we need to fill in for aging baby boomers, et cetera. So, the Obama campaign definitely has a more progressive stance.
Yeah, there was a play back in the 70s called Day of Absence, and it's built on the premise, what would happen if all the black people, I guess it's in the South, disappeared for one day, and I think about what would happen to the country if all the Hispanics disappeared for a day.
Right. Well, there's actually a documentary, or it's like a mockumentary called A Day Without a Mexican, and it plays on that exact.
Right.
We see what happens when people are extracted and how our social well-being, our economic well-being is deeply affected.
Right. For years, there was talk about Hispanics and blacks coming together bringing their common interests together to form some kind of political coalition. But it doesn't seem that that ever happened. It seems that the two groups remain pretty separate, not necessarily antagonistic, but separate. And I mean, do you agree? And why do you think that is?
I think it fluctuates. You know, I had Richie Perez from the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights once talked about how that unity was very apparent on a grassroots level, but when you got into electoral politics, you sort of saw the fighting. So I think it happens in different, it varies from different segments of the community depending on where you're at and what the politics are. You and I both know in New York City history that there's been tension over the mayoral runs between Herman Farrell and Denny Farrell, I'm sorry, and Herman Badillo. But at the same time, when Fernando Ferrer ran, he had a lot of African American support. You know, so I do think there have been tensions, and then there have been moments of cooperation and organizing historically in New York City and nationally. I think that in the context of the campaign, of the presidential campaigns, that it was distorted and made to seem as if Hispanics would not work with an African American candidate or support an African American candidate. We saw that when Dinkins got elected, he had Hispanic support. When Deval Patrick in Massachusetts got elected governor of Massachusetts, he also had Hispanic support. So there's countless examples to counter that, and we were much at the forefront in trying to dispel some of the myths around this sort of, you know, all of a sudden like war between African Americans and Hispanics, you know, so this invented idea.
Do Hispanics emphasize education as a way of achieving success? I know there's a lot of talk about it in the Black community, and to the extent we are actually committed to it as opposed to how much we talk about it, it remains an open question. Is that a big issue among Hispanics?
It definitely is, which is why there's interest in pushing English as a second language, making sure that dual language programs and English language programs within the school system are quality programs, because we know that those are keys for kids who are coming from different countries and who want to succeed throughout the school system to be able to achieve. There was outrage, for example, when Herman Badillo's book came out, where he was downing Hispanics about their interest in education and talking about going into the homes of and I would presume it was Puerto Ricans in the 50s and 60s when he was relocation commissioner, and not seeing one book. I mean, we've known that this community has been an intensely radio community, a community that has read newspapers, that has supported education. We're constantly profiling people who have worked amid the greatest challenges, confronted the greatest odds, and have succeeded throughout the school system and have, you know, become inspirations for other kids. So there is that commitment. I think that it's an easy way to discredit a community when you're saying that they're somehow disinterested in achieving. And what we're seeing is the momentum in New York City and throughout the state, and hopefully that's not put at risk with all of the economic mess, is that when you have the resources, the equitable resources in communities, when you have the commitment, when you have quality teachers, when you have parents who are engaged, you create a school community that can help propel children forward.
How are Hispanic kids faring in New York City schools?
Well, there have been improvements. I mean, a number of schools, there have been improvements in terms of the dropout rate, for example, high school dropout rate. It's of course not where we want to see, but it is moving. There has been some level of progress. There have been a number of schools, and we've seen this with the grading system that the city has issued, that were really at the bottom and have catapulted to the top because they've been able to reorganize. There's been successes with charter schools in East Harlem, for example. So, you know, you're seeing the progress there, and there's clearly a lot of room for improvement, a lot more work that needs to be done.
If John McCain is elected president, how do you think that would affect your constituents versus whether Barack Obama is elected?
Well, he's still a free market advocate, deregulation advocate. So we know that free market doesn't work unless it's regulated. You have to have some rules in place because it's the people at the bottom that get left behind all the time, and trickle-down economics just don't work. So I don't know. I don't think that Senator McCain is in tune to the affordable housing need in New York City. I don't think he doesn't have an urban agenda, as far as I'm aware. Another issue that I've heard actually Senator Barack Obama speak to is this whole school-to-prison pipeline. So that's like another issue that really needs attention, especially in urban centers, especially in New York City, where like there's only several zip codes that most of the prison population comes from. So these issues of the Republican Party takes this attitude that you sort of have to, lift yourself up from the bootstraps. And as Senator Obama says, what if you don't have bootstraps? And that's the scenario, and we're seeing.
Unless you're big business, then you need a lot of
right, exactly. And what we're seeing is what we've seen in recent years, for example, is momentum around prisoner reintegration in their communities, preventing recidivism, having alternatives to detention and incarceration, and that's sort of in terms of having an agenda that deals with a city like New York City. It's something that any candidate needs to be aware of, sensitive to, and actually have some kind of plan toward.
Well, a lot to talk about, a lot to think about, but we're out of time. I do want to thank Erica Gonzalez of El Diario La Prensa for joining us. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.